Don't get on that plane. That's what the little girl said. Voice barely above a whisper. Hand gripping the cuff of his $1,000 coat like he was the one who needed saving. Arthur Hollis almost laughed. He'd flown 243 times in the last decade. Had a board meeting in Zurich. A wife waiting back home. A pilot he'd trusted 9 years. But there was something in her eyes. Something old. Something that didn't belong on a face that young. Why? He asked. She looked at the tarmac. Then at him. Then at the cockpit window where the pilot was running through his checklist. Because the man in there, she said, isn't the same man who flew you last week. Arthur would later say those words saved his life. He'd also say something stranger. Something he never thought he'd admit out loud. That the most dangerous moment of his 61 years wasn't on that plane. It was what he'd been refusing to see for 7 years before it. The girl's name was Mia. Arthur didn't know that yet. He only knew she was maybe 9, maybe 10, in a navy uniform 2 sizes too big, with the look of a child who'd grown up around adults who didn't bother lowering their voices. She was the daughter of the woman who cleaned the private terminal at Westchester County Airport. Arthur had walked past her mother 1,000 times. Said good morning maybe twice. The kind of woman you stop seeing after the first month because she becomes part of the wallpaper, like the leather chairs and the coffee station and the polished brass nobody touches. The kind of invisibility that turns out to be the most useful thing in the world if you happen to be listening. Arthur looked down at Mia and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear exactly. Something quieter. The sense that the floor he'd been standing on his whole life was thinner than he thought. Sweetheart, he said, kneeling down, because some part of him still wanted to handle this the way a powerful man handles small inconveniences. What's your name? Mia. Mia. Where's your mom? She's mopping the bathroom in Terminal B. She told me to wait by the window. She doesn't know I came out here. He glanced at his watch. A Patek Philippe his wife had given him on their 20th anniversary. The hand said 7:51. He was supposed to be wheels up at 8:05. Mia, listen to me. That pilot. His name is Captain David Reyes. He's flown me to Zurich twice a year for 9 years. I know his wife. I know his kids' names. He flew me last Tuesday to Chicago. No, she said. He didn't. Arthur went still. He didn't fly you Tuesday, she said again. Tuesday it was a different man. Same uniform. Same hat. Same walk on the way to the plane. But it wasn't him. I know because Captain Reyes always stops at the window and waves at my mom. He's been doing it for 2 years. He says it costs nothing to make someone feel seen. Tuesday the man didn't wave. Tuesday the man didn't even look. She paused. Arthur could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, which struck him as ridiculous, because he'd closed deals worth 9 figures without his pulse moving. And last night, Mia said, I heard your wife on the phone in the lounge. She didn't see me. I was under the table picking up my pencil. She was crying. But not the kind of crying you do when you're sad. The other kind. What other kind? Mia looked at him with that ancient look again. The kind you do when you've already made up your mind. Arthur Hollis had built his fortune reading rooms. Reading faces across boardroom tables. Reading the small tremor in a man's hand when he was bluffing, the way a woman's eyes shifted when she was about to lowball a counteroffer. He'd been called a lot of things in his life. Ruthless. Brilliant. Cold. But never blind. And yet standing on that tarmac, looking down at a 9-year-old girl in a uniform too big for her, he understood something that should have terrified him. He had been blind. For years. Maybe decades. Because the people you trust most are the people you stop watching. Mia, he said quietly. What else did you hear? She bit her lip. She was doing the math any kid in her position would do. What happens to her mother if she's wrong? What happens to her mother if she's right and she stays quiet? She said a name. Twice. She said, Marcus, are you sure he won't suffer? And then she said, Marcus, I just want it to be quick. Arthur felt his knees go soft for the first time since his father's funeral in 1991. Marcus. His brother-in-law. The one he'd pulled out of bankruptcy in 2016. The one whose daughter's college he was paying for. The one whose name was on 3 of his charitable foundations as a board member because his wife, Eleanor, had begged him to give Marcus something to feel proud of. The same Marcus who, last month at Easter dinner, had asked very specific questions about the flight schedule. Arthur stood up slowly. His knees clicked. His hand found the railing of the boarding stairs. He looked up at the cockpit window. The pilot was looking down at him. And for the first time in 9 years of flying that route, the man behind the glass didn't smile. Arthur Hollis had always believed there were 2 kinds of silence in a man's life. The silence before a decision. And the silence after. Standing on that tarmac, with the cold November wind cutting through his coat and a 9-year-old girl's hand still gripping his cuff, he realized there was a third kind. The silence of a man who finally hears what's been screaming at him for years and has nowhere to put the sound. He didn't board the plane. He told the ground crew his stomach was bothering him. Said it loud enough for the cockpit to hear. Said he'd reschedule for tomorrow. He even managed a small laugh, the kind men his age use to wave off concern. Bad oysters last night, gentlemen. You know how it is. The pilot in the cockpit nodded once. Slow. Measured. The way a man nods when he's been told the deal is off but hasn't decided yet whether to fight about it. Arthur walked Mia back to Terminal B himself. Held her hand like she was his own granddaughter. Found her mother on her knees, scrubbing a coffee stain off the tile outside the women's room. The woman looked up and saw her daughter's hand inside the hand of the richest man she'd ever cleaned a toilet for, and the color drained from her face so fast Arthur thought she was going to faint. Ma'am, Arthur said, and he could hear his own voice shaking, which was new. Your daughter just did something most adults in my life have never done. She told me the truth. The woman didn't understand. She started apologizing. She started promising Mia would be punished. She kept saying, please sir, over and over like a prayer she'd learned in a country where prayers were the only thing that worked. Arthur held up a hand. Gently. Maria, he said, reading the name off her badge for the first time in 3 years of walking past her. I need you to go home today. Both of you. Take a car. I'll have one of my people drive you. Tell no one where you went. Not your sister, not your pastor, not the neighbor who watches Mia after school. Nobody. She stared at him. Is my daughter in trouble? No, he said. I am. And she just got me out of it. It would be 3 weeks before Maria fully understood what he meant. It would be 3 months before Mia stopped having dreams about cockpit windows. But that morning, in a fluorescent-lit hallway that smelled like industrial lemon cleaner, Arthur Hollis pulled out his phone and made the first phone call of a different life. Not to the police. Not yet. To his oldest friend. A man named Sal DeMarco who'd done 32 years as a federal investigator before retiring to grow tomatoes in New Jersey. Sal had warned him about Eleanor in 2018. Arthur had stopped returning his calls for a year after that. Sal picked up on the second ring. Artie. You're supposed to be in the air. Sal. What's wrong with your voice? Sal, I need you. I need you today. I need you to come get me at Westchester. What happened? Arthur looked at Mia, who was now hiding behind her mother's leg, watching him with those eyes that didn't belong on a child. Sal, he said, I think my wife tried to have me killed this morning. And I think she's been planning it since the day I made her sign the prenup. There was a long silence on the other end. Not the silence of shock. The silence of a man who already knew. I'll be there in 40 minutes, Sal said. Don't go home. Don't call her. Don't answer if she calls. And Artie? Yeah. Whoever told you. Protect them. They just became the most important person in your life. Arthur hung up. He looked down at Mia. She was holding a small notebook he hadn't noticed before. It had a unicorn on the cover. Inside were drawings, he would later learn, of every pilot who'd flown out of that terminal for the past 6 months. Names. Dates. Little notes in the corner. Smiled. Waved. Didn't wave. Had a different watch. Walked funny today. A 9-year-old's intelligence operation, run out of a custodian's break room, fueled by chocolate milk and the kind of attention that wealthy men paid millions of dollars to consultants to replicate, and never quite managed. Arthur Hollis had spent 40 years building a life where nothing escaped his notice. And he hadn't noticed his own wife rehearsing his funeral. He hadn't noticed that the last time Eleanor had kissed him on the mouth was 8 months ago, on his birthday, in front of her sister, who had been recording for Instagram. He hadn't noticed that the prescription bottles in her medicine cabinet had stopped being hers somewhere around April. He hadn't noticed that the dog had stopped greeting him at the door. You can build an empire and lose a marriage in the same decade and not know which one was actually killing you until a child in a hallway tells you the truth. Arthur sat down on a plastic chair in Terminal B. The kind of chair he'd never sat in. The kind reserved for people whose flights had been delayed and who couldn't afford the lounge. He pulled out a handkerchief. He wiped his face. He realized he'd been crying without knowing it, which was a sensation he hadn't experienced since the day his son was born in 1983. He looked at his watch again. 8:17. The plane was taxiing out without him. Through the window he watched it lift off into the gray morning sky, banking east, climbing into clouds that swallowed it whole. 22 minutes later, that plane went down over the Atlantic. Mechanical failure, the official report would say. Arthur Hollis would never read that report. He'd be too busy reading something else. The thing nobody tells you about surviving your own murder is how ordinary the next hour feels. Arthur sat in Sal's pickup truck on the side of a service road behind the airport, drinking coffee from a gas station styrofoam cup, watching emergency vehicles tear past with their lights on. Sal had the police scanner running low under the radio. They were both listening to the same words come through in clipped, professional voices. Beechcraft King Air. Tail number November 22 Charlie Hollis. Lost contact. Last known position 14 miles southeast of Montauk. Sal didn't say anything. He just kept driving. His hands at 10 and 2 like a man who'd been taught that way in 1971 and never seen a reason to update the technique. Arthur stared at the dashboard. The plastic was cracked. There was a coffee ring on it that had probably been there since the Clinton administration. He thought about the leather interior of his own car. The wife who'd ordered the leather. The way she'd insisted on butterscotch instead of black because it made the cabin feel warmer. Sal, he said. Yeah. She's going to call any minute. I know. What do I say? Sal pulled into the parking lot of a diner just over the Connecticut line. He killed the engine. He turned to look at Arthur for the first time since picking him up. You don't say anything, Artie. You don't pick up. You let her find out from the news, the way she planned to. You watch what she does in the next 6 hours. Because what she does next is going to tell you everything you need to know about whether this was her idea or whether somebody talked her into it. And that matters. For court. For your kids. For you. Arthur nodded. He didn't trust his voice. His phone was face down on his thigh. It had been buzzing on and off for 20 minutes. He hadn't looked at it once. He couldn't decide if that was strength or cowardice. Inside the diner, Sal ordered them both eggs and bacon and coffee. Arthur looked at the menu and realized he couldn't read it. The letters were there. His eyes were working. But something between his eyes and his brain had stopped processing. He'd read the word omelette 4 times before he understood what it meant. This is what shock looks like in a man who's never been allowed to have any. It looks like a 61-year-old in a custom Brioni suit, sitting in a vinyl booth that has duct tape on the seam, unable to read a laminated menu. Sal ordered for him. Eat slow, Sal said. You're going to throw up if you eat fast. Sal. Yeah. Why didn't I listen to you in 2018? Sal stirred his coffee. He took his time. He was a man who'd spent his career learning that the answer you give a friend at the worst moment of his life becomes the answer he carries for the next decade, so you better get it right. Because nobody wants to hear that the person they sleep next to is auditioning for the role of widow, Artie. It's not a failure of intelligence. It's a failure of imagination. Smart men can't imagine the people they love being smaller than they are. That's the trap. That's the whole trap. Arthur put his fork down. Tell me what you knew. Sal exhaled. He looked out the window. Two old men in a diner. One of them already a ghost as far as the world was concerned. I knew she'd met with a divorce attorney in 2017. Quietly. Never filed. I knew she walked out of that office because the attorney told her she'd walk away with maybe 15% of what you were worth on paper because of how you'd structured the trust. I knew she went home that night and didn't say anything to you. That's what bothered me. Most women would have come home angry. She came home and made you a pot roast. Arthur closed his eyes. I remember that pot roast. Yeah. I bet you do. That was the night she said she wanted to renew our vows. Sal didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside the diner, a woman walked past holding the hand of a little girl in a puffy pink coat. The girl was telling her mother something with her whole body, gesturing, hopping a little with every other word. The mother was bent down listening. Actually listening. The way mothers listen when the child is young enough that whatever she's saying is the most important news in the world. Arthur watched them through the glass. He thought about his daughter, Caroline, who lived in Denver now, who he hadn't seen since Thanksgiving. Caroline who told him at 23 that Eleanor was performative. He hadn't known what that word meant in that context. He'd asked her to explain. She'd said, "Dad, she's playing a part. She's been playing a part the whole time. I don't know how you don't see it." He'd told Caroline she was being unfair. He'd told her marriage was complicated. He'd told her she didn't understand what it took to build a life with someone over 30 years. He'd been so good at defending his wife to his own daughter. So good at it. His phone buzzed again. He turned it over. 23 missed calls. 11 from Eleanor. 4 from Marcus. 3 from his executive assistant, Patricia. 2 from his lawyer. 3 from numbers he didn't recognize, which meant the news had broken and reporters were already calling. There was a single text message from Eleanor. Sent 8 minutes after the plane had gone down. It said, "Baby, please tell me you're okay. Please call. Please." The word baby hit him like a punch. She hadn't called him baby in 4 years. He'd noticed at the time. He'd told himself it was natural. He'd told himself 30-year marriages don't have babies in them anymore. He'd told himself a lot of things. She was performing. Already. 40 minutes after she thought she'd killed him, she was already practicing the voice she'd use for the cameras. Please call. Please. The triple please. The lowercase intimacy of it. Some part of her had been writing this text in her head for years. Arthur set the phone down. He looked across the table at his oldest friend. Sal. Yeah, Artie, I want to give her enough rope. Sal nodded slowly. How much rope? Arthur picked up his fork. He took a bite of eggs. They tasted like cardboard, but he chewed and swallowed because he understood now that he was going to need his strength. Enough rope, he said, that when this is over, my daughter never has to ask me again how I didn't see it. They drove to a motel off Route 7 in Danbury. The kind of place that takes cash and doesn't ask for ID if you don't make eye contact. Sal had been there before. Arthur didn't ask why. The room had 2 double beds and a television bolted to a particle board dresser. The carpet had a stain near the door that looked like coffee but probably wasn't. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed nearest the window and watched Sal set up 2 laptops on the desk. What are those? One's mine. One's yours. Burner laptops. Bought them in cash last year for a different thing. Don't worry about it. You've been ready for this. Sal didn't look up. I've been ready for something, Artie. Not this exactly. Just something. The television was on with the sound off. CNN had it already. Private plane carrying billionaire industrialist feared down off Long Island coast. They were using a photo of him from a Forbes cover, the one from 2019 where he was standing in front of a turbine at the Pittsburgh plant. He looked younger in the photo. Not because of his face. Because of his eyes. The man in that photo still believed in the woman waiting for him at home. Arthur turned away from the screen. Sal. Mia. What about her? Where is she right now? Sal pulled out his phone. Made a call. Spoke for 30 seconds in the low murmur of a man who'd given orders his whole adult life. Hung up. She's at a Holiday Inn in White Plains with her mother. My niece is sitting with them. They have food. They have cable. The mother knows nothing yet except that you asked her to lay low and you're paying her for the day. Mia knows something happened but she doesn't know what. She's drawing in her notebook. What's she drawing? Sal almost smiled. My niece said she's drawing the motel room. Every detail. The lamp, the curtains, the carpet pattern. She said the kid's a little FBI agent. Her words. Arthur looked at the ceiling. He thought about his own grandchildren. 2 of them. Caroline's kids, in Denver. 6 and 4. He hadn't seen them since August. He'd missed the 4-year-old's birthday because of a trip to Singapore. He'd sent a check. A big one. Caroline had thanked him by text. THX Dad, very generous. 3 words. Punctuation of a closing door. He'd told himself she was just busy. He'd told himself she was raising 2 small children and didn't have time for long phone calls. He'd told himself a lot of things. That was the phrase that kept coming back to him in that motel room. I told myself. Over and over. Like a man taking inventory of every lie he'd ever signed off on, every story he'd accepted from himself just to keep moving. He told himself Eleanor was happy because she said she was. He told himself Caroline was distant because she was busy. He told himself Marcus was grateful because he sent thank you cards at Christmas. He told himself his life was full because his calendar was. A man can drown in his own narration and never make a sound. Sal. Yeah. How do you live the next part? Sal turned in his chair. He looked at Arthur the way he'd looked at him when they were both 19 and shared a dorm room at Fordham, and Arthur's father had just died and Arthur had asked him a version of this same question. You live it one ugly day at a time, Artie. You don't try to feel better. You don't try to be wise. You don't try to forgive anybody on a schedule. You let it be ugly. You let it be small. You let yourself be a man who didn't see what he should have seen, and you stop punishing yourself for being human. And then one morning, maybe a year from now, maybe 2, you wake up and you notice you slept through the night. And that's the beginning. Arthur nodded. He didn't believe him. But he nodded. By 2 p.m., the Coast Guard had recovered debris. By 3 p.m., they were calling it presumed loss of life. By 4 p.m., Eleanor had given her first statement, on the front lawn of their house in Greenwich, wearing a black coat she hadn't owned that morning. She must have had it ready. She must have had it in a closet somewhere, in a garment bag, waiting. That was the detail Sal pointed out, sitting beside Arthur on the bed, watching the muted footage. Look at the coat, Artie, look at the cut. That coat is brand new. That coat has been waiting in a closet. Eleanor was crying. She was crying the way Arthur had seen her cry at her father's funeral in 2004. He remembered thinking then that she was the bravest woman he'd ever met, holding it together for her mother, for her sister, dabbing her eyes only when the cameras swung her way. He realized now, watching the screen, that he'd been watching a rehearsal. She'd been rehearsing for 2004. She'd been rehearsing for this. Some women cry. Some women perform crying. Arthur had spent 31 years unable to tell the difference because he'd never wanted to know. Marcus was standing behind her. One hand on her shoulder. Not the hand of a brother. The hand of a man who was waiting for the cameras to turn off so he could put his arms somewhere else. Arthur watched Marcus's face in the background. The mouth was sad. The eyes weren't. The eyes were doing math. That was when Arthur understood that this had never been about the money. The money was the reason. But it wasn't the cause. The cause was something older. Something that had been growing in his own house, in his own bed, for years, while he was on planes. While he was closing deals in Zurich and Singapore and Sao Paulo. While he was being a great man in every city in the world except the one his wife lived in. He'd been an excellent provider. He'd been a terrible witness. And somewhere along the way, the woman he'd married had decided that the only way to finally be seen was to make sure he stopped existing. Arthur stood up. He walked to the window. He pulled the curtain back 2 inches. Outside, in the motel parking lot, a man was loading a child's seat into the back of a minivan. The child was already in his arms, asleep, head on his shoulder. The man kissed the top of the child's head before he buckled her in. It took Arthur a full minute to understand why he couldn't stop watching. It was because he had never done that. Not once. Not with Caroline. Not with his son. He had been at the office. He had been on a plane. He had been at a board meeting. He had been somewhere important. He had built a fortune for his family by being absent from his family. And his family, in his absence, had become a stranger he'd been sleeping next to for 31 years. He let the curtain fall. Sal. Yeah. I want to disappear. For real. For a week. Maybe 2. I want her to bury me. I want her to read the will. I want her to start spending the money. I want to see exactly who she becomes when she thinks she's won. Sal looked at him for a long time. Artie. That's a hard thing to come back from. Even after. Even if you win the case. Your kids are going to read about you in the news being dead. Caroline is going to find out from a reporter. No, Arthur said. Caroline's going to find out from me. Tonight. On that burner laptop. Face to face. She's the only person on earth besides you and Mia who's going to know I'm alive. Sal nodded slowly. And your son? Arthur was quiet for a long moment. My son hasn't spoken to me in 2 years, Sal. He'll find out when the world finds out. And he'll grieve me for however long he grieves me. And when I come back, he'll have to decide what to do with the fact that I let him grieve. That's the price I'm paying for being the father I was. He sat back down on the bed. I want to know what kind of man I really am, Sal. Not the man on the Forbes cover. The man who's left when you take the company away and the wife away and the calendar away. I want to meet him. I'm 61 years old and I've never met him. Sal got up. He walked to the mini fridge. He pulled out 2 small bottles of bourbon, the kind they put in motel rooms for men whose marriages are ending. He cracked them both open. He handed one to Arthur. To the man you haven't met yet. Arthur clinked the little bottle against Sal's. To the man I haven't met yet. Outside, the November sun was going down behind a Cumberland Farms sign across the highway. The light was the color of old brass. Somewhere, his wife was on her second television appearance of the day. Somewhere, his daughter was about to get a phone call that would change her father's place in her life forever. Somewhere, a 9-year-old girl in a Holiday Inn was drawing a lamp with a crooked shade and 3 burn marks on the base. And somewhere inside Arthur Hollis, in a room he'd kept locked since he was about 12 years old, a light was starting to come on. He called Caroline at 9:14 that night. The video came through on the burner laptop. She picked up on the second ring. He saw her face before she saw his. She'd been crying. Not the performed crying. The other kind. The kind that hollows out a 38-year-old woman until she looks like a child again. Dad? That one word. It took everything he had not to break in front of her. Caroline. Listen to me. I'm alive. I'm alive, sweetheart. I'm safe. Her face went through 4 different shapes in 3 seconds. Disbelief. Rage. Relief. And then, finally, something that looked like grief moving in the wrong direction, grief in reverse, grief unwinding itself. She didn't speak for almost a minute. She just sat there. Her hand over her mouth. Her eyes wide and wet and locked on his. You're alive. I'm alive. Where are you? I can't say. Not on this call. I'll tell you when this is over. Dad. Yeah, sweetheart. It was her, wasn't it? He nodded. He didn't trust himself to say it out loud yet. Caroline closed her eyes. Tears ran down the sides of her nose. She didn't wipe them. She just sat there with her eyes closed, breathing the way she'd breathed as a little girl when she was trying not to throw up. I knew, she whispered. Dad, I knew. I've known for years. I didn't have proof. I just had a feeling. And every time I tried to tell you, you'd defend her. And I'd go home and tell Michael, my own father thinks I'm crazy, and Michael would say give it time, and we'd give it time, and nothing changed. I know. You don't know. You don't know what it's like to watch your father be slowly killed by the person sleeping next to him and have no way to make him see it. He took that. He took every word of it. He sat there in a motel room in Connecticut while his daughter said the thing she'd needed to say to him for 10 years, and he didn't defend himself, didn't explain, didn't soften any of it. He just listened. For the first time in his adult life. When she was done, she was crying so hard her shoulders were shaking. He waited. He let her cry. He understood now, sitting there at a particle board desk in a $49 room, that he had spent 31 years interrupting his own daughter's grief to manage his own discomfort. He had done it at her 6th birthday party when her hamster died. He had done it at 14 when her best friend's mother got sick. He had done it at 23 when she tried to warn him about his wife. He had been an interrupter of grief. That was a sentence he would carry to the end of his life. Dad. Yeah, sweetheart. How did you find out? A little girl told me. Right there on the tarmac. 9 years old. Daughter of the cleaning woman at the terminal. She'd overheard your aunt on the phone. Caroline laughed. A wet, broken laugh that wasn't a laugh at all. Of course it was a kid. Of course it was. Adults are too well-mannered to tell rich men the truth, Dad. We learned that. It's the first lesson rich families teach. You don't tell Daddy he's wrong. You don't tell Daddy his wife is a snake. You smile, and you take the check, and you go home, and you cry in your own kitchen. He didn't have a response to that. There wasn't one. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and walk with us, day by day. Because I have a feeling, if you're still here, if your eyes are still on these words, you know somebody like Arthur. Maybe you've been somebody like Arthur. Maybe somebody in your life has been trying to tell you something for years, and you've been too busy being important to hear it. There's no shame in that. There's only the question of what you do tomorrow morning, when you wake up and remember. Now back to it. Caroline wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked like she was 12 years old. He'd forgotten she had that face. He'd forgotten she'd ever been 12. What do you need from me, Dad? Nothing. I need you to grieve me on the news for a few days. I need you to not tell Michael. Not yet. Not because I don't trust him. Because you can't pretend the way I'm asking you to pretend if anybody's watching you do it. I need you to be a daughter whose father just died. Out there in public. And in here, with me, 3 times a day on this laptop, you get to be a daughter whose father just came back to her. She nodded slowly. And the boys? The boys are too young to act, Caroline. You tell them whatever you need to tell them. You're their mother. You know better than I ever did. She looked at him for a long time. Dad. Yeah. This is the most honest you've ever been with me. I know. It took your wife trying to kill you to get here. I know. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard you say. He nodded. He couldn't speak. She closed her eyes again. When she opened them, something had shifted. He could see it. Some calculation she'd been carrying her whole life had just resolved itself. Dad. Listen to me. When you come back. When all of this is over. I don't want a bigger check. I don't want a trust adjustment. I don't want a place on a board. I want you to come to Denver. I want you to sleep in our guest room. I want you to learn how to make pancakes with Emma on a Saturday morning. I want you to take Henry to the park. I want 1 full week of you in my life with no phone, no plane, no driver. And then we'll see. He nodded. He couldn't speak. Dad. Yeah. Say it. Say you'll come. I'll come. A full week. A full week. Pancakes. Pancakes. She laughed again. A real laugh this time. Small. A little crooked. But real. Okay, Dad. Okay. I'll be your widow for a while. I'm not going to like it. But I'll do it. After he hung up, Arthur sat in the dark for a long time. Sal had gone out for sandwiches. The motel room was quiet except for the hum of the heater and the distant sound of a truck downshifting on the highway. He thought about all the calls he'd taken in his life. The deals. The mergers. The condolences. The congratulations. The boardroom calls at 3 a.m. from Tokyo. The calls that had made him rich. The calls that had made him important. None of them had ever made him this tired. Or this awake. He understood now, sitting in the dark of a motel he wouldn't remember the name of by Christmas, that he had spent 40 years building a life he wasn't living in. And it was going to take everything he had left to move in. The funeral was on a Thursday. Eleanor wore black again. A different coat this time. Floor length. Italian wool. She'd cried in 3 networks worth of cameras by then, and the country had decided, by some quiet consensus, that she was handling it with grace. There were op-eds. There were tributes. There was a piece in the Times Sunday section about the widow of the industrialist, the woman who'd stood beside him for 31 years, the woman who'd lost not just a husband but, as she put it in one of the interviews, my best friend, my partner, my reason to come home. Arthur watched it on a laptop in a borrowed cabin in the Adirondacks. Sal had a cousin who hunted up there. The cousin had been told nothing. Just, some old friend needs a place to disappear for a couple weeks. The cabin had no television and no internet, but the burner laptops worked on a hotspot, and that was enough. Arthur watched his own funeral the way a man watches a movie he's already seen. He knew the lines. He knew the music. He'd lived inside the marriage long enough to recognize the score. The thing that surprised him wasn't her performance. The thing that surprised him was the empty pew where his son should have been. His son, Daniel. 36 years old. A poet in Portland. The boy he'd called soft his whole life. The boy he'd told, at 16, you can't make a living writing poems, son. The boy who'd written him a letter at 19 that began with the words, Dad, I think you've never actually looked at me, and Arthur had read 3 sentences of it and folded it up and put it in a drawer and never finished it. That letter was still in the drawer of his desk at the office. He'd thought about it maybe 4 times in 17 years. Daniel had not flown out for the funeral. Eleanor had told the cameras, with a small dignified sadness, that Daniel is grieving in his own way. We're respecting that. Arthur read between the lines. Daniel had not flown out because Daniel had not been willing to perform for his stepmother. Daniel had decided, somewhere in his 30s, that he wasn't going to put on a suit for a woman he didn't love so the cameras could approve of the family. Arthur sat in the cabin and understood that his son, the poet, the soft one, the one he'd been quietly ashamed of for 20 years, was the only person in his bloodline who had refused to fake anything. He pulled out the burner. He wrote a draft of an email. He didn't send it. He couldn't send it. Daniel thought he was dead. But he wrote it. And he saved it. And he labeled the file, "For when I come back." The email was 4 sentences long. Daniel. I read 3 sentences of your letter in 1996. I'm 61 years old and I'm finally going to read the rest of it. I'm sorry it took this long. Your father. He closed the laptop. He sat in front of the wood stove for a long time and watched the fire move. By the second week, Eleanor had started spending. Sal's people were tracking it. Not illegally. There were ways. She'd already met twice with the estate attorney. She'd already initiated a transfer of 3 properties into a holding company in her own name. She'd already had Marcus over to the house in Greenwich for what the security log called a private dinner. She'd already ordered new towels and shades that Arthur had hated and she had known he'd hated. The new towels were the detail that broke something loose in him. Not the affair. Not the murder plot. Not the will. The towels. He sat in the cabin and laughed out loud. The kind of laugh that comes out of a man when he's been holding something for too long and finally has somewhere to put it down. He laughed until he was crying. He laughed until Sal came in from chopping wood and asked him what was so funny, and he couldn't even explain it. He just kept saying, "The towels, Sal, the towels," and Sal looked at him for a long moment and then started laughing too, because what else do you do? 2 grown men in a hunting cabin, laughing about bath towels, while a country grieved a man who wasn't dead. That night, Arthur slept 11 hours. He hadn't slept 11 hours since college. He woke up at 9 in the morning to the sound of a woodpecker outside the window, and for a single confused second he didn't know where he was, didn't know what day it was, didn't know if his wife was downstairs making coffee or whether she was in Greenwich choosing throw pillows for a sofa he'd be buried under. And then he remembered. And he lay there in the unfamiliar bed and felt something he had not felt since he was 19 years old. He felt unscheduled. Not free. Free was too big a word. He wasn't free. He was, technically, still married to a woman who was trying to inherit his estate. He had 3 weeks of theater to perform before he came back from the dead. He had a son he hadn't spoken to in 2 years and a daughter he was learning how to be a father to in real time over a laptop and a 9-year-old girl in a Holiday Inn who was the reason any of this was happening at all. He wasn't free. But he was unscheduled. His calendar, for the first time since 1978, had nothing on it. No flights. No meetings. No dinners. No wife. No press. No board. Just him, and a wood stove, and a woodpecker, and the sound of his own breath in a room that smelled like cedar. He got up. He made coffee on the propane stove. He went outside in a borrowed flannel shirt that was 2 sizes too big and stood on the porch in his slippers and watched the steam come off the surface of the lake. And he thought about Mia. He'd been thinking about Mia every day. Sal had set up a system. Maria and Mia were no longer at the Holiday Inn. They were in a small rental house in upstate New York that Sal had arranged through a third party. Maria had been told only that Mr. Hollis wanted to make sure they were safe and that someone would be in touch when it was time. Maria had not asked questions. Maria was the kind of woman who had learned, in her 43 years on earth, that when a rich man tells you to lie low, you lie low and you don't ask why. But Mia knew. Mia had figured it out within the first 3 days. Mia had asked Sal's niece, very directly, "Is Mr. Hollis alive?" Sal's niece had not known what to say. Mia had said, "It's okay. I won't tell my mom. I just need to know." And Sal's niece had nodded once. And Mia had nodded back. And the 9-year-old had gone back to her drawing. That was the report Sal had brought back. Arthur had heard it and gone outside and stood by the lake for an hour. He understood, standing on that porch with the steam rising off the water, that the most important relationship he was going to build in the rest of his life was with a child who was not his blood, whose mother cleaned bathrooms for a living, who had saved him without knowing the full size of what she was saving. He understood that he owed her something he didn't have a name for yet. Not money. Money was easy. Money was the language of every wrong move he'd made for 40 years. He'd already decided, on the second night in the cabin, that Mia and Maria would be set for life. College for Mia. A home for Maria. Healthcare. The whole architecture. That part was settled. What wasn't settled was the harder thing. The harder thing was, what kind of man do I want to be in this child's memory? Because she was going to remember him. For the rest of her life. She was going to tell this story to her own children one day, the story of the morning she pulled a billionaire off a plane. And the way she told it would depend on who he became in the next 30 years. Not the next 30 days. The next 30 years. He sat back down inside. He picked up the burner laptop. He opened a blank document. He started a list. It wasn't a business list. It wasn't a strategy. It was just names. Caroline. Daniel. Emma. Henry. Mia. Maria. Sal. 7 names. He looked at the list for a long time. He realized that was it. That was the whole list. 31 years of marriage, 40 years of building, 400 employees, 6 homes, 11 board seats, 2 ex-presidents on his Christmas card list. And the list of people he actually owed something real to was 7 names long. He didn't feel sad about it. He felt clear. For the first time in his adult life, Arthur Hollis felt clear. He closed the laptop. He went outside again. The woodpecker was still working on a dead pine across the clearing. The lake was completely still. He had 3 weeks before he came back from the dead. He intended to use them. He came back on a Tuesday. There was no press conference. There was no live broadcast. There was a courthouse in White Plains, a federal prosecutor named Diane Ortega who had been working with Sal for 16 days, and a sealed indictment that named 4 people, including the pilot's brother, who had taken his place in the cockpit, and a maintenance contractor in Farmingdale who had been paid $48,000 in cash to look the other way during a pre-flight inspection. Eleanor was arrested at 7:40 in the morning, in the kitchen of the house in Greenwich, while she was pouring coffee into a mug that said, "World's Okayest Wife." It had been a gag gift from her sister 3 Christmases ago. She'd kept it on the counter the whole time. Arthur was not there for the arrest. He'd asked specifically not to be. Sal had told him, "Artie, you've earned the right to watch." And Arthur had said, "Sal, I've watched enough. I don't need to see her face. I need to never see her face again." That was the line he came back to over and over in the months that followed. I need to never see her face again. Not out of hatred. Out of something simpler. Out of the understanding that some people, when they show you who they really are, deserve to be believed the first time and never granted a second audience. He flew to Denver that same Tuesday afternoon. Commercial. Coach. Window seat. He paid for the ticket on a credit card under his own name and watched the gate agent's face when she scanned his ID. She looked up at him twice. She didn't say anything. She handed him his boarding pass and her hand was shaking a little. The news had broken 6 hours earlier. Industrialist Arthur Hollis found alive. Plane crash investigation, now murder conspiracy. Wife among those charged. He'd watched it happen on a television in the federal building. He'd watched the country recalibrate in real time. He didn't read any of the articles. He'd read enough of his own press over 40 years to know there was nothing in them for him. On the plane, the woman next to him was reading a paperback novel and eating peanuts out of a small foil bag. She didn't recognize him. He had a baseball cap pulled low. He had a 4-day beard. He looked like somebody's grandfather flying out to see the kids. Which, as it turned out, was exactly what he was. Caroline met him at baggage claim. She didn't say anything when she saw him. She just walked up and put her arms around him and held on for a long time. Long enough that people started to walk around them. Long enough that the man at the rental car counter looked over twice. Long enough that Arthur understood, finally, what his daughter had been waiting for from him since she was 6 years old. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a college fund. It wasn't a wedding. It wasn't an inheritance. It was an arrival. She drove him home. Michael was at the house. Michael shook his hand, awkwardly, the way a son-in-law shakes the hand of a father-in-law who's just been resurrected from a federal scandal. Michael said, "Welcome, Arthur," and Arthur said, "Thank you, son." And Michael's face did something.